Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I am honored today to have my partner. I consider us partners and friends working together for Ukraine, Professor Gertis in from his channel, Professor Gertis Explains UA. On my Discord, I am having a lot of very healthy and positive conversations in regard to the Trump appointments for cabinet positions and other offices. And to be quite honest, Professor Gertis and I talk quite often. Stay in your lane, stay where your expertise is. And for you, Greg, it's inside Ukraine, it's those relations with Ukraine and other events and other nations you work in. Professor Gertis, guys, in case you don't know, his PhD dissertation was in the formation of the Constitution, and he understands the processes of American politics, especially in regard to Washington, D.C. So, Professor Gertis, thank you for coming on my channel today and helping my community and whoever else may see this understand what's actually happening right now. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here. What can I answer for you?
Well, here's the question. I'm watching my Discord, and people, Americans and people from around the world, are looking at the Trump appointments and immediately looking into their background, statements they
Mhm.
made a year ago. And of course, I'm not speaking about policy toward the United States right now. This is specific. How will this potentially affect Ukraine? Just so many across the board comments that are on polar opposites. So I thought today, let me take 7 or 8 minutes, get Prof in here, and explain to the world what is actually happening here. So, what's going on with these picks, and what is the process going forward during the transition of power to the new administration?
So some of the appointments are good choices, some are bad choices, some have nothing to do with Ukraine, and you have to take them as a one by one, right? But you also have to understand what Trump is, what MAGA is, and what they hope for. So Trumpian republicanism, MAGA type of republicanism is actually populism, not conservatism. And populism, you're sticking up for the little guy, and like we want to kick the system in the teeth, and that sort of like that's the motivation. So the crazier the choice, the more the average guy that voted for Trump likes it. Okay, so let's frame it that way first of all, because that's going to make a little bit of sense of why we're doing some of the things that we're doing. There are also going to be Trump loyalists, people that are already philosophically inclined to do what Trump does, or Trump has a good relationship, or both. And when you frame it that way, a lot of the picks make sense as well. So if you want to talk about specific picks, I'm all open to talk about
I
whoever
do
you
want
want
to
to talk
talk about specific picks in just a moment, and I know people will be interested in this portion. But can you explain first? President elect, for example, picks Representative Elise Stefanik to
about.
potentially become the new ambassador to the United Nations representing the United States. Some of his picks require Senate confirmation, others do not. Let me just list these really quickly. The ambassador, of course, requires Senate confirmation. Governor Kristi Noem, Homeland Security, doesn't really affect Ukraine, requires confirmation. Lee Zeldin, EPA, Senator Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Senate confirmation, of course, affects Ukraine. Mike Huckabee, ambassador to Israel. I personally feel that affects Ukraine because Israel and Ukraine are connected, especially now that Russia is putting military bases along the Syrian border, even more of them, and that's a fact we can talk about on another video. Representative Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, confirmation required. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence. John Ratcliffe, CIA. Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, Senate confirmation required. Matt Gaetz, Attorney General, Senate confirmation required. And then some others: Stephen Miller, Chief of Staff Deputy, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, Tom Homan, Border Czar, and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, Deputy of Government, Department of Government Efficiencies. Those do not require Senate confirmation.
Mhm.
So let's first, can you answer in a nutshell, what does that Senate confirmation mean? How does that happen?
Yeah. So generally speaking, Senate confirmation is for cabinet level, where there's what's called advice and consent of the Senate. So the president says, "I nominate Pete Hegseth to become the Secretary of Defense," or "I nominate Matt Gaetz to become Attorney General," and then the Senate has to vote to confirm or deny that that's the case. Now, generally, they largely confirm whatever the president has. Philosophically, I think generally the president should get to pick whatever team he wants. Whether the wisdom of this is a good pick or not individually is a secondary question, but generally the president should get to pick his team and then do what they can with the team that they pick. But the system is geared that the Senate has it. It's just a check on if they know that there's something corrupt or villainous or whatever, they can actually have some impact as well. Now, the Senate is 54, I think, 54 Republicans, something like that. So they have a majority. They can push in anyone that they want to if they all go that way. But the Senate's not the House. There are old school Republicans in the Senate that could push back and very likely might on a few of these. And if there's enough Democrats and a few Republicans that break, they can thwart some of the nominations. I think that the most likely candidates for that would be the Attorney General in Gaetz. Like
Hmm.
Gaetz has some issues,
Well,
some
let me.
significant ethics issues.
Okay. So
And
we would call that rubber stamping, where the Senate would just rubber stamp his decision, it person's in. But you're saying on a couple of these, don't expect a very quick rubber stamp on several
no,
of his
I'm
picks.
saying that they may or may not do it. I don't know what they will or won't do, but some of them are kind of shoe-ins, right? Like I don't think anybody's going. You used to mention Huckabee. I don't think anybody's going to have any on the Republican side have any issue with Mike Huckabee being the guy for Israel. He'll be very good for Israel and very hard on Iran, and that's good for Ukraine ultimately. I don't think there's going to be any issue there. I don't think that they're going to have an issue with Mike Waltz. I do think that it might have an issue with Gabbard and Gates. I think those are the most dangerous ones. Now, remember, I said the MAGA mind is different. So when you're looking at this, I was telling my wife yesterday, it's almost like they're stars for The Apprentice or something. Like if you look at the cast of characters, they're more prominent MAGA media stars. Like Christine Nome, I'm not really comforted by her as a Secretary of Homeland Security.
Hmm.
I like the general that he picked the first time, General Kelly. Like I want it to be somebody who looks like they did bad things to bad people.
Hmm.
Like that's who I want to be in place. But
Well,
these
let
people
me
are
ask you this
all
question then, since
go
you're
ahead.
you're speaking directly about a couple of choices here. I chose a few here, not all of these images that could potentially affect Ukraine. Now, guys, please understand. I know many of you watching this from around the world. Professor Gertis and I are both Americans, and we love our country. We are conservative Republicans, and we want our nation to improve, of course, because the stronger America gets, the more we can help Ukraine, the more we can be a shining light in places like Africa and the Middle East where they struggle, and America has traditionally helped in large ways. We want that to continue, but for that to continue, our country needs to get stronger. With that said, looking at some of these choices, where I will now analyze that they could affect Ukraine specifically. Representative Elise Stefanik, UN ambassador. Good?
Okay, so she'll be really strong on Israel. I'm not sure where she's going to be on Ukraine. Probably moderately okay, but not really full throated. Nikki Haley was the UN ambassador, and you know how strongly she supported Ukraine. And so you're not, I don't think you're going to see quite the same thing. And that's partly because the default is like, this Ukraine thing, that's not really that's how MAGA mind tends to think. Um, so I don't think she'll be as strong, but she could surprise you.
Okay, and you already have mentioned Governor Kristi Noem. I, like you, personally do not prefer this pick. I would prefer more of that, our Homeland Security, the general land, taking care of
And
our.
she's a governor of a state, and you don't get to be a governor, generally speaking, by not having something upstairs.
Mhm.
So I mean, she doesn't have to know all the secrets of Homeland spycraft in order to manage the process. But I still would have been comforted by General Kelly.
Lee Zeldin, we'll just leave that off the table for now for the
He won't
EPA.
have an impact one way or another.
Okay, let's come down to Senator Marco Rubio, Secretary of State.
So this is an interesting one because remember in 2016, I voted for Rubio in the primary over Trump, right? And so like that would have been my presidential pick. He ultimately lost to Trump in the primary season. Remember little Marco, right?
Hmm.
Okay, but the Secretary of State is all this one gives me weird hope. And it does for a couple of reasons because he's fundamentally a conservative who has been talking a little bit more of a MAGA-like line lately, adjusting to the prevailing winds. But he's fundamentally anti-communist. He doesn't really like Putin. Like that will come through. But he's not pro-Ukraine. Like he's made some statements that like, well, we got to take care of our own stuff, in other places as well. And he's really hawkish about China. So he's watching what's going on there. I think he could turn out to be bad, but he's more likely to turn out to be good in my estimation. And here's the thing about Rubio. Now, a lot of former presidents or former secretaries of state. Hillary thought she was a shoo-in because her last job before she came in to run for president was Secretary of State, and that's a very common thing in the U.S. Political. Over the course of our presidents, a lot have been former secretaries of state. So this gives me hope for a future that is not Vance, but is Rubio to vote for when we have that fight for the soul of the Republican Party down the line.
Here,
So he
here,
gives me hope for a few different reasons.
here, I completely agree with you. So, I was watching some folks talk about Marco Rubio's comments in regard to Ukraine. My issue is not with the comments he made. My issue was with the timing. They were pulling up comments made 12 months ago, 18 months ago, and 24 months ago.
Yeah.
We're in a completely different world than 12, 18,
Well,
and 24 months ago.
he's going to have to do the will of Trump, but he's going to try to do it, I think, with still so Rubio is really ideologically conservative, even if he's speaking a little bit more populist like now, he's still ideologically at the core conservative. This is the thing that makes Trump a wild card is that he has no real ideological center. He can go this way or that way. We can't really quite predict. But Rubio, I think, will like his compass keeps pointing to the right. So I think he'll be okay.
That
Huckabee,
would
we already talked. Go ahead.
No, no, I was just going to say, you're making that statement and you're talking about the different viewpoints and the ideological bases. That's why I just caution people. Even last night on my live stream, I was talking about the Frontline in depth. I said, guys, just be patient. Don't take one piece of information or one old quote and just run with it and let that form how you view a person or a pick. So it's very important. The tempo of this world unfolding right now, especially in regard to Ukraine and Israel, internally in the United States, European relations is at a much quicker clip than even 12 months ago with adjustments that are happening in all these nations. So I am also hopeful and optimistic for Senator Marco Rubio.
Huckabee is kind of like Rubio, where it's not going to have that great of an impact, I think, on Ukraine, although it could from where he is. But his internal compass is very solidly conservative. But he's a conservative who appreciates Trump, which is different than a MAGA Republican. And he's been very supportive of Trump, but he's not the bambast. So he's not a bomb thrower. He's
Hmm.
not like yeah. So MAGA is kind of a reaction to woke. On one side is the woke progressive. On the other side, MAGA is kind of a reaction to it. He's not of that kind of character, and so he's more still in the conservative camp. And I think he'll be fine as well moving forward.
In
Waltz, I
regard,
talked about yesterday.
let me just say one thing about Huckabee, and then you keep going. In regard to Huckabee and Israel, even just take Huckabee off the table right now. Just in general, my dear friends, the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel are connected. Russia is
They are.
involved in both of them in very large ways. Of course, they are the invading nation in Ukraine, but they are supplying Hezbollah and Hamas at a high level.
Hmm.
Additionally, it was 2 days ago I got information where Russia had put three new outposts overlooking the Syrian Israeli corner right there for just keeping their eyes on the situation. And then, of course, we know the relationship with Iran that is interconnected. So, guys, when it comes down to it for Ukraine, Mike Huckabee can play an important role in supporting Ukraine as he stands for Israel. Representative
And
Mike
he's no
Waltz.
slouch either in his own right. He's a former governor and former presidential candidate, and
Yes,
so
he
like
is.
he'll be fine.
TV host, musician. He's well rounded. He's a good speaker and very experienced. Okay, on to Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor.
Yeah, I'm most comforted by Mike Waltz. I talked about him yesterday. I was thrilled to see that, like, he's the guy that's going to be replacing Jake Sullivan, a former Green Beret. It'll be a different day in the way that Trump gets his assessments, and that's going to hopefully counterbalance some of the maybe not so great stuff that he's getting from Tulsi Gabbard for the DNI. So, but Mike Waltz will be a trusted guy. He's, I think, like Huckabee, a conservative who appreciates Trump, and that's different from being a MAGA, 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 MAGA
Hmm.
all the time kind of guy.
Let me ask you this question. Just we're trying to educate people. If these guys are approved, which we expect most to be, when do they actually take their office? Does this
Yeah,
transition after the inauguration or before?
yeah. I mean, it will not before the Biden administration's over, so that you get that stuff sorted out as quickly as you can, have them in place, and then like your first order of business is to get them installed so that they can do their jobs.
So it's a
And yeah,
relatively
it won't
quick
be very.
process.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
and it can be quick. Like Huckabee will fly in, but I would expect Gates to have longer time in that process.
Okay, as we close out, just a look at the last few ones here. Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff, Susie Wall, Chief of Staff, no vote required. John Ratcliffe, CIA Director, vote required. I'm going to come back to the middle one in just a second. Tom Homan, the border czar, no vote required. I will, if you're going to want to have a little fun here, of course, you guys know that Tsar is a Russian word, so maybe we could change that title. Tsar means king.
TSAR though,
It
isn't it?
doesn't matter. Tsar.
Well, Tsar is just Caesar. I mean, that's where it comes from.
Tsar.
It comes from Caesar.
Tsar.
SAR and SAR, TSAR and CZEAR comes from the derivation of Caesar.
I
That's.
understand, but in the Russian language, it means king.
Oh yeah,
Word
yeah, I understand
king.
that, and
Yeah.
that's because they're
So,
giving him as much power as possible in order to do this thing. Now, this goes back to the Obama administration. Actually, used a lot of these czars for this, czars for that. So, I'm probably saying what you're about to ask: why a border czar as opposed to whoever's in charge of the border or secretary of whatever? And that's because he doesn't have to be appointed because it's a position just below the cabinet. So it's a way of going around the actual process. But they're going to get like this guy is going to. He's a former ICE director, acting ICE director, and he will be doing everything possible to make the border close properly. So that we don't have the problem that we've had over the last 4 years. And then that's actually a good thing because when that happens, it takes away the argument of, well, how can we help Ukraine when there's all this problem at the border? Well, that'll dissolve if Tom Homan does his job. So we'll see how that all plays out.
okay, let me ask you a couple of key questions here that has been ramping around in my Discord and other places. Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, 44-year-old, not a lot of political experience, military experience, Fox News correspondent, et cetera, and other things on his resume. Your thoughts on Pete Hegseth?
Yeah, I just did an entire video that I'm about to put out if I haven't already put it out by the time you put this out on it's called The Meaning of Pete Hegseth, because Pete Hegseth is there not because of Ukraine or Ukrainian views or anything like that. He's there for domestic political purposes, and I explained it all thoroughly in that particular video, so I would urge you to watch that. But it's essentially because Trump wants him there to do something domestically within the military. That's why he's there. Now, he is a major from the National Guard. combat decorated veteran, 2 Bronze Stars. Like, he's no slouch in that department, but he's missing the steps. And I gave this example earlier in that video. I said, look, I mean, I have a PhD. I have been on my school board. I've taught EDD students, that those getting a doctorate in education, been on their dissertation committees, but nobody's tapping me on the shoulder and saying, hey, would you like to be the Secretary of Education? Like, I'm missing some steps here, right? That's kind of where we are with Hegseth, but that doesn't matter because he has a good personal relationship. He's leans toward the MAGA position, particularly where it matters in the domestic realm, and it's not about Ukraine for Hegseth. So he could be good or bad on Ukraine, and it's hard to determine that, but he's not there for Ukraine.
So
That's not why he's being picked.
does a Hegseth get rubber stamped, or that may be a pick that is discussed?
That's probably the second tier. Like, if I was worried about like who's gonna, like, some will sail through, and then there's a second tier with Hegseth. He might have some issues, but then the bottom tier would be Gabbard.
We're coming there. Let me ask you this question, and we'll get to the last two. So Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, huge businessmen. Of course, Elon Musk, Starlink, on calls, calling Zelensky, talking about Starlink, all of these things. Many people have said, you know what, he's a little too close for these conversations that have already been happening. And now we see that he's going to be appointed Department of Government Efficiency, no Senate confirmation required. A, what is your thought on this? And B, is this a conflict of interest? Is he too close? The man owns Twitter. The man owns Tesla. The man owns SpaceX.
So Mark Cuban had an interesting perspective many months ago. He said, Elon Musk and other billionaires are in behind Trump because of a Bitcoin play, because they want to see Bitcoin actually get the green lights to be its own currency. And traditionally, it's been kind of stopped by our Treasury Department as far as not really getting. So there might be something to that where he gets something out of it, but I don't know what the it is enough to be able to say that there's a thing there. I don't see that Elon Musk is going to be sitting in a cubicle somewhere, going over the paperwork of what it means to make things more efficient. There's a lot that they have to actually go through. They were gleefully talking about this on either MSNBC or CNN last night. I don't remember which one I was watching. They're talking about how, to undo these regulations, they have to go through this laborious labyrinth of undoing regulation. Like, it's going to be a hard process. No, they're going to be kind of steering like, yeah, we need more freedom in this area. And then there'll be some underlings like cutting through the regulations, trying to figure out what they can chop out to make things more efficient. Okay.
You're
more
describing
efficient toward what end?
You're describing figureheads.
That's correct. I think they're figureheads. And the reason that there's two there is because Vivek was really all MAGA. As soon as he dropped out, like even while he was running, he was like Trump light. And so this is to try to reward him for the loyalty, for being what he was during the campaign.
Well, there's one thing that we can confirm today, and that is Bitcoin is at all-time high.
Yeah, it is. And that's because they're predicting that it's going to be a thing, especially now that Elon Musk's involved in it. So
okay, well, let's go to the last two, and I'm saving the big ones for last. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, must be confirmed, and Matt Gaetz, Attorney General, must be confirmed. Not only just a little bit about these candidates, and then any effects here for Ukraine or the world.
Yeah, so I talked about these will have, Tulsi will have a significant effect on Ukraine. I don't know that Gaetz will. So let's talk about Tulsi first. She's a former lieutenant colonel in the Army National Guard, so she has that background. She sat on committees like an intelligence committee and a Homeland Security committee and things along those lines while she was in Congress. So she's not a slouch. Like, she didn't skip the steps like Pete Hegseth, right? But she's there because she's ideologically aligned. She's there because she has a good relationship. it's almost like Trump likes putting more glamorous looking people in places as well. It's like some kind of marketing thing. It's a
Hmm.
weird thing. I think there's something to that as well. Um, so
A lot of them look
she,
alike.
yeah, yeah. So
It's-
like, yeah, you got to wonder if she was homely and had a PhD in Coke bottle glasses, if that would be, the same thing. Like, so that's just speculation on my part.
yes.
But but she's fundamentally pro-Russian in her orientation, and that's very troublesome. Now, so she's bought the line, and she's been on with Tucker many, many times on Fox News when Tucker was still there, because she was a Democrat who was essentially saying the pro-Russian kind of lines. In my three big stories, which I was just putting together, I found there was a tweet of her saying, on the day after the invasion, this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for if the U.S. and NATO had simply respected Russia and didn't try to push Ukraine into NATO.
Isn't
The
she
day
one?
after, in 2022.
Hmm.
So that'll come out on tonight. My three big stories
And
where I talk about these guys. Um,
isn't she?
but
She's one that
yeah,
also pushed biolaboratory narratives with
yeah,
Tucker.
she
Hmm.
she she was big into. I mean, if there was a Russian propaganda line, she would be pushing it. So she's problematic. Now, I also want to caution this. I wouldn't say that she's a Russian agent, because I see a lot of stuff floating around like, oh, she's bought and paid for by Putin. No, I think ideologically she's on the same page, but that's not the same thing as being bought and paid for. So you've got to separate that and be as fair as possible. Um, but I don't think she's good. I,
Okay.
I hope that she runs into significant resistance. I hope the Democrats are flipping out about her, and the conservative Republicans, the John Thune. Oh, by the way, John Thune just won in the Senate. That's huge,
Yes.
because now you have in the Senate a McConnell-like figure who's old school Republican like I am, who will fight for those kinds of values. And in the Senate, you don't think about, like, you're like, I'm here for 6 years. I'm here longer than the president's here. So Thune won the race against Rick Scott, for example, who would have been all MAGA, and so that was big. But so I hope there's enough resistance to see Gabbard, because she was a Democrat who became kind of, through progressive Bernie Sanders-ish kind of lens, over to MAGA side, and then repeating all the uh, Russian influence, Republican MAGA kind of stuff. She's not good. She's like the worst out of this bunch. And that's before I talk about Matt Gaetz, who's the worst, but not the worst for Ukraine. So Matt Gaetz is the worst because he's actually dodging an ethics investigation. He just stepped down from the House. In 2 days, he was supposed to have an ethics investigation thing drop on him. This was the same thing that was about to happen when he called for the vote on Speaker McCarthy 1 year ago, causing the House to go into all that confusion. He's the guy behind it because he's trying to dodge what appears to be sex with a minor investigation. And yeah, he's not a good guy as far as I can tell. But he's appointed because he speaks MAGA all the time, thinks MAGA, dreams in MAGA, and as Attorney General, he will be Trump's revenge on the Justice Department for what he sees as lawfare
Hmm.
waged against him by Democrats. So you got to understand that Democrats look at what happened in the United States with Trump and say, see, he's a convicted felon. The MAGA folks think that it was Democrats using the Justice Department to unjustly go after Trump with cases that never would have come against somebody if their name was Bob Smith or Jim, you know,
Jones. Did I lose Professor?
did
There
I
you
just
are.
lose you?
No, I got you back. There
Okay.
you are.
It froze up. Whatever that person's name
I
was, if
called
it
him Jim
wasn't Trump, it
Jones.
wouldn't. Well, should have gone after someone. So at any rate, so the MAGA crowd is convinced that the Department of Justice would have been what has been wrongfully used to go after Trump. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Department of Justice in the United States is a really weird instrument. it is under the executive authority, but that becomes a political football. So the Department of Justice veers to the right during a Republican administration and veers to the left during a Democrat administration. And it's really strange. It really should be, uh, uh, I don't even know how to describe it. Like an atheist, like that kind, agnostic
Hmm.
toward political kinds of things, like the military generally is, right? It should be agnostic, but it's used politically. And Matt Gaetz is Trump's revenge for what the Democrats have done in Trump's mind to Trump.
So it sounds to me, if I'm hearing correctly, I saved these two for the last page on purpose, and I did properly. Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz in a completely different world. Do you feel that maybe someone like Tulsi Gabbard or Matt Gaetz could not be approved?
Yeah, it's possible that
Okay.
both of those, either or both, could not be, might not be approved. But I don't know that. I'm not predicting. I can't
Hmm.
predict it. I just don't have enough. It would be a big ask to ask senators to go against Trump, like in the first few weeks of the term, like
Yeah.
could make life hard. So, but these two are the least likely, and I don't know that Matt Gaetz would have a lot to do with Ukraine. But domestically, he's MAGA revenge.
Agreed. But, if you have those type of character questions even floating around you,
That's right.
attorney general is not the proper position, period.
That's right.
So that's where we're at. Prof, I want to thank you so much. You helped me immensely. For those of you that are in my Discord, you've been asking all these questions and wanting some information. You got it today from an expert who understands this. If you guys are here and you want to hear more in depth, for example, on some of these appointments that Professor Gertis is doing deep dives on, please you go check him out at Prof. Gertis Explains over there on YouTube. I want to thank you for being here, Professor. As always, appreciate your friendship. And by the way, you guys pay attention. Prof and I have some new projects in the pipeline coming
Hmm.
to support Ukraine, coming to a station near you. Thank you.
Thanks
Have a
for
great
having
day.
me.
Have a great day. You're welcome.